I know that we can.
I know darn well we can work it out. Oh, yes, we can. I know we can. Yes, we can. Oh, why can't we if we want to? Yes, we can.
I know we can make it work.
Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for allowing us into your home, your automobiles, on the plane, the train, wherever you are today. And I'll tell you, I have an exciting show for you today. Dr. Douglas Mungin is an advocate for the homeless and a scholar. In 2021, he was the breakout star of the #1 Netflix documentary Crime Scene Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. His scholarship on Skidrow reached millions of viewers across the globe and cemented him as the official Skidrow historian. He's advocated for the homeless for over 20 years, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Mungin is a graduate from Louisiana State University with a PhD and San Francisco State University with a BA. He was raised in abject poverty in Inglewood, California, tore up from the floor, broke, busted, and disgusted. He is a renowned poet also, as is the director of my studio. He is a professor at Solano College, where he leads several committees on student equity and activism. He is the director of the speech and debate team, where he will be inviting me to come and speak very soon. I'm joking. And he will be requiring his students to watch this podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Douglas Mungin. Dr. Mungin, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Pastor Manning. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction.
Tell me who you are.
So my name is Dr. Douglas Mungin. I currently am a professor at Solano College up here in Northern California, the Vallejo, Fairfield, Vacaville region. But primarily my work deals with the history of homelessness and the construction of homelessness as a political identity. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about homelessness, I think that for a lot of us, we see it as this issue that's impacting us like today. Mm-hmm. But if we were to look at the history of it, we realize that this has been an issue that's been impacting America since the 1800s. Mm. And the ways that we've approached homelessness hasn't worked for all of those years. And unfortunately, we recycle the same bad ideas. And so what I do is I look at kind of the history of different laws of different homeless communities throughout the nation, but specifically the homeless community of Skid Row is my primary focus, and kind of understanding how that space was constructed and kind of the stories and the history of that place, and making it an important place in the history of Los Angeles. Because I don't necessarily think that we think of Skid Row as being a part of the history of LA. But if we were to look at the activism, if we were to look at the ways in which police enforcement, laws of who is allowed to be in certain places, concentration of poverty, we realize that Skid Row is an important piece of the puzzle of understanding Los Angeles, but also kind of the grand scheme of America.
Now, when you talk about recycling the same bad ideas, that stood out to me. Unpack that for me. Give me an example of some of the bad ideas that we currently are recycling as it pertains to the homeless, not only in LA, but around the country.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the primary things that we do specifically in terms of law enforcement is to police the homelessness out of certain areas, specifically by incarcerating homeless individuals. And so if we think that if we incarcerate them, all of a sudden homelessness goes away, or if we ship the homeless folks out, then they'll stay gone forever, not realizing that homelessness is part of a larger process of in terms of kind of disenfranchisement of poor Black folks, just poor folks in general, lack of education, substance abuse, all of these societal ills and personal ills don't go away just by shipping a person to another location or incarcerating them. And unfortunately, since the 1910s, even before then, that's been our primary function of dealing with homelessness, is through incarceration or through removal.
You know, I participated in a Feed the Hungry program. My organization feeds hungry people on a daily basis. But I participated in a program in Beverly Hills, and I ended up quitting that program when I found out that it is a policy in Beverly Hills, or was, I don't know about now, this is a couple of years ago, to piggyback off what you were just saying. When homeless people came to Beverly Hills, they gave them a bus ticket to anywhere else other than Beverly Hills because they didn't want encampments in their area. So I'm going to ask you a huge question. So the mayor's race is over. Karen Bass has won, or Rick Caruso, whichever one, has won, and they call on you, Dr. Mungin, and say, we are ready now to confront homelessness in Los Angeles. We want to start with Skidrow. What do we do? You are the homelessness czar. What are some of the things you would do to deal with the epidemic, the crisis, the emergency that we're dealing with on Skidrow right now? What would you say to them?
Well, I think the first thing is permanent housing and getting folks off the street. I think one of the things that we realize, especially looking at the research, is that even one day being homeless leads to kind of crises. So it's, one day being homeless and out on the streets, it leads a person to kind of choose not only bad habits, but also it has an effect on a person long term. And so like the psychological and the mental aspect of it. So getting people off the streets is kind of the first thing that we need to do. And so right now, I know that there's a lot of efforts and policies and a lot of money actually being put into Skidrow right now in terms of building permanent and temporary housing. So beefing up that effort, I think, is the first thing, but also putting in more money in terms of for different services, specifically in terms of psychological and substance abuse substances is key. But I think one of the things that Los Angeles hasn't done well, and a lot of places haven't done well, is actually sharing the crisis. What I mean by sharing the crisis is that right now, homelessness and specifically the epidemic is centralized into certain locations. And then when it spreads out into other areas like Beverly Hills or into the West Side, we immediately try to pack those folks up or take away those encampments. Now, what's happened is that we don't build those same kind of psychological and substance abuse services in other parts of the city. And so poor areas, our Skid Row becomes the primary area where everyone has to be funneled through. And this was an intentional choice, starting back in the late 1960s to funnel everything through Skid Row. But as we've seen, Skid Row has exploded. There's more and more homeless people than we've ever imagined in Los Angeles in the 1970s. And so therefore, the rest of LA has to kind of share kind of like that, those policies of helping others, because right now there's just a lot of areas that don't want to talk about it, or they think that it's centralized to certain locations. But outside of that, I also think changing the zoning laws of Los Angeles. There's a lot of places in Los Angeles that doesn't have a lot of residential zoning or doesn't have high concentration zoning. And so because of that, we aren't building enough homes for folks. And if we're looking at the population now, most of the folks who are becoming homeless are students, they're working moms, they're folks who have jobs who still can't afford rent. And so the face of homelessness is changing. And so therefore, we have to make sure that we have a safety net for those people by actually increasing the amount of housing, not just for homeless populations, but just in general for most of Los Angeles. And the easiest way to do that is changing some of these zoning laws in some of these locations that refuse to have high density residential areas.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back after this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. You're watching some of the fascinating interviews that you only get here at Yes We Can podcast with Pastor Sherman D.Manning. I am Pastor Manning. I want you to know that we need your help. Many of you send me text messages, you send me emails about how great this show is. You love it. It's better than Democracy Now!, fascinating tales, interesting stories. I like your interview style. Lots of you accuse me of being a television show host before, saying that there's no way I can do it this way, having never done it before. But I give all praise and credit to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It is God. But I'm going to need your help to stay on and to keep bringing these podcasts to you. We're on Spotify, Apple Music. I'm trying to think of the others that we're on. YouTube, Facebook, etc. I need your help. It's just that simple. Sit down today, write a check for $100, $10,000, 500, whatever it is. No donation, tax deductible donation is too large or small. You can mail it to us at 5857 South Central Avenue, Suite 180, Los Angeles, California, 90001. I'm going to be looking for your help. If you want to send it instantly with your credit card, go to yeswecanworshipcenter.org. You can click donate now and send your donation today. Before I get back to this interview, I do want to tell you, you have to go back and watch some of the great interviews we've done. You want to see the one with Caru, Khero. You want to see the interview with Brian Ulf, ULF. You want to see the interview with Frank Gooch. You want to see just Sister Teresa. Go watch that interview and share the links with others. Give us a thumb up. When you watch me on YouTube, like the video so that people will know that you like. I'm going to get back to this interview, but I need your help today. Help us house the homeless, feed the hungry, and stay on the air by sending your tax-deductible donation today. We can stay on the air. We can help. We can make a difference. We can do it together. Yes, we can. Now, let's get back to the interview. You're joining me with Dr. Douglas Mungin, a Skidrow researcher, a brilliant brother, and we were talking about homelessness. And when you said homeless students, it struck a nerve with me. I think there's something there ought to be a sin to have a student who's homeless in this country. How many homeless students would you estimate there are?
So in terms of like homeless students, there's been some research coming out recently that shows there's about 10 to 20,000 in America of homeless students in America. And I know in California, that population is the majority of that population. I know currently in Northern California and even in Oregon, I do some work with some organizations in Southern Oregon that a lot of the community college students, a lot of the students who are going to universities are sleeping in cars. And so these are kind of like the hidden homeless populations that we have where students who are still going to school, still doing the work, but who are forced to kind of live in shelters or forced to live in their cars. And that's part of this epidemic that I was talking about a little bit earlier of finding housing for individuals who are lower income, and lower income folks are primarily students. And so this is a huge issue that I think that most of us are not talking enough about.
Yes.
But I think that a lot of homeless scholars are starting to talk about it, but I think the general public has no ideas how far reaching this epidemic actually is.
Yeah, when you think about some of my Republican brothers and sisters who like to talk about not giving handouts, people just needing a hand up, and do for self in kind, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. Again, I reiterate, to the point of being redundant, I think there's something sinful about a college or high school, for that matter, student trying to better themselves while sleeping in the car. When you think about some of these institutions of higher learning, and I don't want to single anybody out, but USC, UCLA, et cetera, they have billions of dollars in endowment funds. I just believe that if I were president of that college and I found out I had 30 students who were coming to college sleeping in their cars, I, the university head, will provide housing for them. I think that's just absolutely ridiculous. Dr. Mungin, what made you so interested in studying homelessness to the point of becoming an expert and a scholar on the subject?
A lot of back in the day, in my early 20s, I did a lot of work working with nonprofits, and I was met with a lot of homeless students or students with housing insecurity. And so my interest peaked up there, but this issue is personal for me. So in my 20s, I reconnected with my father. At the age around 16, I became distance from my father. He suffered from various addictions, etc. And so in my mid-20s, having a child of my own, I was able to reconnect with my father and found out that he actually lived on Skid Row. Wow. He lived in a SRO on Skid Row for the last 10 years. And so in that in those moments of kind of reconnection, I started to kind of walk with him through Skid Row, you know, just having just kind of father-son talks. And I just became really interested in this area because I realized that, you know, the Skid Row that I had in my head was different than the Skid Row that he lived in. And the Skid Row that he lived in was an area where folks knew each other, that folks had conversations, they had histories, and some folks still had jobs. And a lot of the folks who remained on Skid Row stayed there and started to volunteer and help others out who were new to Skid Row. And so that was something that I had no idea about, that this wasn't just like an area where folks get dropped off or just desolate like poverty. This was an area that was a community. This was an area that had a history. This was an area that had its own identity within Los Angeles. And then I started to connect with a lot of the nonprofits and the folks working there and a lot of the community members. And I just realized that a lot of the battles, specifically that we talk about in terms of civil rights, that we talk about in terms of just like gentrification, police enforcement, et cetera, that a lot of those issues had their start in the construction of Skid Row or in Skid Row. This is where a lot of those policies began. And so because of that, I thought this was incredibly interesting. And so I began to write my dissertation about 10 years ago on Skid Row, and I called Skid Row the headquarters of homelessness, that there's a Skid Row everywhere. This is just the headquarters. And that was a title that my dad gave me, that saying that, like, look, that there's poor communities and there's homeless communities all across the United States. And Skid Row kind of represents kind of the symbol of homelessness. And so to understand homelessness, you got to go to the center, right? You got to go to the source. And so I've been doing my work now on Skid Row for about 10 plus years. And have just been studying, kind of tracking the history of Skid Row and connecting it to the history of the larger homeless movement within the United States, and understanding some of the problems of homelessness, but also just since I started seeing homelessness explode just throughout the nation. I have folks contacting me in like Florida, in Arizona. I had folks contacting me like even in the UK saying like, look, this is an issue here too, or even in Vancouver. And so understanding that there's a lot of folks who want to talk about this topic or who want to know more, and there's just not a lot of research on it, or the research that we have is kind of that bootstrap kind of mentality that like, oh, the people who are homeless are predominantly those who are mentally ill, who are on substances, or who just don't want to work hard. And unfortunately, that's kind of been the rhetoric for so long that we don't understand the complexity of this issue.
Wow. Unpack gentrification for me, for the person who's watching who has never heard. I think the first time I even heard the term was I was watching a movie called Boys in the Hood back in the day. And I remember the father-son, and he began to explain gentrification. But explain gentrification to my audience.
All right. So gentrification, I think the ways that we talk about it now is different than 10 years ago. So for me, gentrification, people move, right? Like communities move in and out. That's just the way things have always been. But gentrification is when there's a community that wants better resources and fights for those resources. But unfortunately, they never get that from the city or from the government, et cetera. And then you have these market forces where richer folks, or people with a little bit more money, begin to move into these lower income areas because they're cheap to move into. And so when those folks come in, and traditionally they're middle class white folks, move into these areas because they're full of history, they are full of art, they're full of culture, etc. And so they move into these areas. And then the population begins to change, but also more resources come into those communities, resources that the previous community was asking for generations. And so gentrification for me is not necessarily about who moves into the area. It's about what resources were denied traditionally. And I think that's the issue here, is that we have these communities. We look at it like in South Central LA, you know, for the last 20 years, we've seen gentrification where you have this like traditional, you know, African-American base of folks. And now you have folks with a little bit more money moving in. And now there's Starbucks. Now there's like all of these amenities that folks have been asking for years that were denied. But all of a sudden there's a new population moving in, and now those resources are coming in.
Yes. an example of that. My great-grandmother, Clara Jackson, rest in peace, the community where she resided, her house, I think she bought it for $15,000 back in the 30s or 40s. And I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. There was this area called Linwood Park. Do you know that they tore her house down, and those houses rebuilt, same size house, same community. Those houses now in Atlanta, which is a lot of money for property in Atlanta, which is a lot less than in LA. Those houses are $750,000, and it is now a gated community and is full of our white brothers and sisters. So that's an example of what you're talking about. Dr.
Same
Mungin
thing happened in New Orleans after Katrina too. So
Wow.
yeah, that's there were Black in areas that all of a sudden got moved out, white
Right.
folks come in, and now those houses are worth triple the price.
Yes. Do you think that homelessness on Skid Row in Los Angeles and in other places has been criminalized by the police?
Oh, absolutely. I think we actually just saw it today with the situation that's happening in Florida and Martha's Vineyard, where the governor of Florida just sent 2 plane loads of immigrants to Martha's Vineyard because he
Right.
didn't want to deal with them.
Right.
And so that's at the far end of the spectrum. But I think we can kind of see those same kind of policies emerge where in terms of like jaywalking, in terms of just loitering, those laws picked up in the 60s because of the homeless epidemic then in the 1960s. But we also see that our homeless brothers and sisters are also penalized more. They're incarcerated
Yes.
more than other forms of the population because of where they live or where they don't live. Recently, there was a case about 15 years ago of property, and specifically what is considered property. And so if you're homeless, all you have is a shopping cart, right?
Right.
And so you have your belongings there. And cops were coming in and throwing away the shopping carts of these people
Right.
because they considered it trash. Now, there was a judge at this time in this case, I believe it was the Levin case, who said, so if I were to leave my car in a parking spot and I left, would that be considered trash? And the cops was like, no, that's not trash. That's your personal property. And the judge says, so what's the difference of a person with a cart who leaves their cart there and then comes back to their cart that has their personal belongings in there?
Right.
And the cop says, well, you own that car and that person is just a cart. And so just kind of we realize like there's 2 dynamics here of how we treat what we consider normal citizens and how we treat those that we consider homeless. And so if a person is considered homeless, therefore their property isn't actually property.
Right.
We consider their property trash.
Right.
And on top of that, like we can incarcerate them a little bit easier because we know that they're not going to fight the system. They're not going to fight the laws. And so unfortunately, the ways in which we also concentrate that, where in Skid Row, I remember when I was first doing my research there were cops kind of stationed. If you're unfamiliar with where Skid Row is, it's right in downtown Los Angeles. It's like right on the border of East LA and downtown LA. There's a literal LA River separates East LA from Skid Row. Right. And so there were cops positioned like near the borders of Skid Row during this time period in the kind of late aughts and to stop the folks coming from Skid Row into the larger downtown area. So even where a person can move in a city is dictated to them if we consider them homeless or not. And so I think that's a huge issue that we have in our society where we think that we can treat people who are homeless worse, right? Like I think that's what we see every day, that if we see a homeless individual, I don't have to talk to them. I can step over that person. I consider them lazy. I consider them so I think that just the mentality that we have around homelessness needs to change. And unfortunately, that's also influenced our police enforcement of homeless individuals.
When did Skid Row as we know it begin? What year?
Yeah, so in 1968, there was what this was called the Silver Book. So do you remember Bunker Hill? Like the Bunker Hill area in LA. So in the 1960s, there was this project to get rid of Bunker Hill because it was kind of a lower income area. So they wanted to kind of revamp Bunker Hill in downtown. And so what we saw across the United States was kind of this removal of their Skid Rows. And so in Chicago, it had one of the largest Skid Rows Rows. And so what happened there is that they put more industry, more commercial buildings there, and basically kind of like moved out all of the lower income folks and the poor folks from that area. In New York, the same thing happened with the Bowery. And in Los Angeles, we try to do the same thing with Bunker Hill. And so in 1968, we tried to establish what was called the Silver Book, which was to basically get rid of Skid Row. And so what happened was Skid Row activists during that time period, folks working with homeless communities, but also folks from other areas of Los Angeles who didn't want poor people in their area, came together and they created what was called the Blue Book. And so the Blue Book was what we now call the creation of Skid Row. And so what it did was it concentrated social services predominantly for homeless individuals. So we have more drug treatment facilities, we have work facilities there, but also housing. Single room occupancy hotels began to open, lower income housing began. And so in 1972, what we know as Skid Row began. And that was a concentrated effort to make this a service-centered ghetto. Now, there's some other really interesting histories that go into kind of why we wanted that Skid Row in that area. So during this time period, we realized that, hey, if we centralize this effort, this community can be able to kind of speak up for themselves in terms of like what they need, but also this will funnel them. So like we can get them into Skid Row, get them the necessary resources, and get those folks back out into the community. And so unfortunately, in the 1980s, we saw the crack epidemic, we saw the heroin epidemic, and Skid Row exploded. And so all of the services that we had provided, all of the housing was inadequate for that area. And so we kind of saw the explosion of what we now call Skid Row in the early 1980s.
Wow. The Blue Book. I never heard that term. You're educating me as we go. Are you familiar with the lawsuit that has been filed on behalf of the homeless in which the city has settled and the county settled a couple of days ago?
Yes.
What do you think about that? Do you think that's going to have a great impact on Skid Row?
I hope so, but I don't necessarily think it's going to have the long-term impact that we want, because the long-term impact is to get folks off the streets, right? And so until that happens, and until there is like a concerted effort and a process to make that happen, I'm always a little bit skeptical about winning lawsuits. I don't think that we can fix the issue of homelessness inside of a courtroom. I think this is going to be a concerted effort with communities opening up their spaces, but also the city of Los Angeles putting their money where their mouth is in regards to like really helping folks who are in dire need of being helped.
Okay. I've pitched the idea. I think I want to have a homelessness summit, and I want to bring in brilliant folks such as yourself, some of these other organizations, and let's see what we can do. Because I think one of the problems is it's like sometimes when I feed on Skid Row, I'll come in and feed, and then 45 minutes later, someone else will come to the same area and do a feeding. It's like we have all these cooks in the kitchen, but no one is orchestrating the work and the efforts that we do. Listen, it has been a very, very enlightening to have you on the show. I've got to have you back again, and I mean very, very soon, but I'm almost out of time. Last words, anything else you want to say, and do you think we will ever solve this homelessness epidemic in Los Angeles? Do you think it's ever going to happen?
I think so. Well, I hope so. And I think that, like you were saying, there's folks coming in to help. I think that there is a need, and I think there's a want of folks who want to go in and help this issue or fix this issue. And I think that the city of Los Angeles and the communities, they really want to fix this issue. And it's going to take a concerted effort by not only the people of Los Angeles and the government, but also the folks who own the real estate and the folks who are in charge of kind of the services to kind of all come together as one and actually come up with solutions. Because right now, everyone is separated. Everyone is siloed. This person's doing this organization is doing that. And until there's a concerted effort where everyone knows what the other hand is doing, I think until that happens, this issue will still continue. But I hope that eventually, with more efforts like the forum that you are proposing, and just more folks just talking about this, will lead us to a situation where we can actually address this, in a situation where we're not trying to just force people out of homelessness, but we actually are giving a person a hand, and showing them a path to getting off the streets and living the life that is the life that they want to live, not one that we are forcing them to live.
There you go. Got to get you back. Final thoughts. Anything else?
Thank you so much for having me. I think that this issue of homelessness is it's an epidemic that I think that a lot of Americans are really worried about, and it's touching closer to home. Just recently, there was an LA Times post that said that over 50% of African Americans in the city of Los Angeles know someone who has lost their home or has had housing insecurity in the last 3 months. And so we realize that this is an issue that affects Black folks a lot, Black and brown folks a lot, but also it's affecting everyone, no matter where you are in America, whether you are in a big city or if you're in a rural town. That homelessness and housing insecurity is something that we realize is important and something that needs to be fixed. No child or no person deserves to sleep on a street. That we all need a bed, we all need a roof over our heads, and hopefully my work can lead more folks to understanding how we got here, but also work that you guys are doing with your organization and others can provide some insight and some help for folks that are really in need of it.
Amen to that. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you want more from Dr. Mungin. You can email me any suggested questions that you want at shermand.manning@gmail.com, and I'll get him back on, and I'll do my best to ask some of the questions that you would like for me to ask him. I want to thank you, Dr. Mungin, for coming on the show on short notice. You did a wonderful job. Ladies and gentlemen, this issue of homelessness is an epidemic. LA is supposed to be the city of angels, but it is the city of the highest rate of homeless people in the country, probably on the planet. We have to do something about this. We can't just keep doing the same old thing that we've been doing, because that is the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I'm calling on pastors, I'm calling on teachers, professors, lawyers, millionaires, billionaires, thousandaires, and even hundredaires. Let's get together. If you all have any ideas about this homelessness summit that I'd like to have, again, email me and let's talk about it. Remember that we can make a difference in our community. We can make a difference in our church. We can make a difference in our city. We can do it together. Yes, we can.